Sunday dinners were sacred on Baldwin Street. Even as the old houses leaned slightly with time and the cracked sidewalks told their own stories, every Sunday, you could smell fried catfish, greens, and fresh cornbread wafting out of open windows. The hum of gospel from radios mixed with laughter, front porch chatter, and the soft clinking of iced tea glasses. It was here, in this black middle-class neighborhood tucked outside Macon, Georgia, where June Harper had lived her whole life. A widow of nearly 20 years, she was known for her sweet potato pie and her unwillingness to miss a church service, even when her knees started to ache. People knew June. She was the kind of woman who raised not only her own children, but a couple of others who needed it too. She kept every birthday card she ever got in a shoebox, paid her bills in person, and still used a flip phone. When her health began to decline, forgetting names, leaving the stove on, neighbors watched with concern. That's when Lindsay came home. Lindsay Harper was the granddaughter who always stood out. College-educated, ambitious, polite in public, though sometimes with a cool edge. When she moved back into June's house, folks nodded with approval. "She's doing right by Miss June," they'd say. She posted smiling selfies with her grandmother, often captioned "Quality time with my favorite girl," or "Blessed to care for Nana." She repainted the porch, started tending the garden. From the outside, it looked like a young woman stepping up, returning the love that raised her. There were little things at first. June stopped showing up at church. Lindsay would explain she was tired or the heat was too much. A couple of friends said June hadn't called them back in weeks. But life was busy, and folks gave the benefit of the doubt. After all, June had someone now. Someone who was supposed to love her. The town breathed easier, trusting that the bond between grandmother and granddaughter would be enough. Trusting that blood mattered. That legacy meant care. In hindsight, those were hopes built on soft ground. It's easy to look back and ask how no one saw it sooner. But trust doesn't die with a scream. It fades in silence. And in the quiet corners of that creaking house, behind drawn curtains and locked attic doors, something far more sinister was beginning to unfold. Lindsay's smile to the world masked a truth she was carefully burying upstairs. At first, it really did look like love. Lindsay played the part of the dutiful granddaughter with convincing ease. She kept June's medications sorted in a plastic organizer. She drove her to early doctor's appointments, or at least said she did. She handled the mail, tidied up the house, and even managed the growing pile of bills, often sighing dramatically, as if it were a burden she bore out of devotion. And maybe for a little while, she believed her own performance. After all, love and obligation blur easily when money's involved. Online, Lindsay crafted a portrait of selflessness. Facebook albums showed her smiling beside her grandmother, faces pressed close, June's confusion carefully hidden behind filtered photos. Instagram posts showed garden beds she planted in honor of Nana's favorite lilies, along with updates like, "Another long day, but she's worth it." Strangers and distant relatives alike commented, praising her strength, her compassion. "She's an angel," one cousin wrote. "We need more young people like you." The praise emboldened her. So did the privacy. With her mother long gone and June's mental health fading, Lindsay became both gatekeeper and narrator. She decided who got updates and when. She filtered every version of June's story through her own. And when people asked to speak directly to her grandmother, Lindsay deflected. "She's sleeping. She gets anxious. She wouldn't understand." It started to sound less like care and more like control. Still, to those not paying close attention, Lindsay was a blessing. A young black woman sacrificing her career, her independence, to care for a frail elder. It's a story people want to believe. It restores something. Dignity. Family. Tradition. But not everything that looks like sacrifice is noble. And not every caregiver is kind. June, meanwhile, was slipping. Not just into dementia, but into silence. Her presence in the world dimmed like a fading porch light, barely noticed until it was gone. She no longer had a voice in her own life, but few noticed. Lindsay was speaking for her, smiling for her, signing for her, and somewhere between the grocery lists and the staged photos, Lindsay began preparing for something far more permanent. She wasn't just maintaining June's life, she was mapping the exit. With the language of love, she laid the groundwork for betrayal. And behind every gesture of kindness, there was a calculation. She understood what people saw when they looked at her, the story they wanted, the mask she wore. It would be months before anyone questioned whether the angel with the garden gloves might also be a thief. It started with missed calls. Nothing dramatic, just the kind of small, accumulating absences that make you pause, then shrug. Cousin Darlene had called twice on a Tuesday. No answer. Unusual, but not alarming. By Thursday, she'd called 5 times and left a message. "Hey Miss June, just checking in. Call me when you get a minute. Love you." That message was never returned. A week passed, then 2. Darlene drove by the house once, but Lindsay wasn't home. The garden looked tended, and the porch was clean. A box of groceries sat neatly on the steps. June's lace curtains were drawn. She must be resting, Darlene reasoned. Still, a knot had begun to form in her stomach. She wasn't alone. Other family members had started noticing a pattern. Birthday wishes went unanswered. Lindsay responded to texts late, if at all. "She's confused a lot lately," she'd say. "She gets anxious when people call too much." There was sympathy at first. Aging is messy. Dementia robs people in waves. But Lindsay's tone, clipped and defensive, didn't feel like grief. It felt like insulation. Then came the cancellations. A Sunday visit Lindsay postponed last minute. A doctor's appointment Lindsay claimed June had forgotten. But no one had seen June in person for nearly a month. Even their longtime pastor, who'd been visiting members recovering at home, had been turned away. "It's just not a good time," Lindsay said at the door. "She's not herself." Still, doubt crept in slowly. The family didn't want to assume the worst. Black families, especially those forged through hardship, often carry deep respect for privacy. No one wanted to accuse someone who had stepped up. But the tension grew. Then came a strange moment, a small one but chilling. Darlene sent June a birthday card. She always did. A week later it was returned. No longer at this address. Confused, she called Lindsay, who claimed it must have been a mistake. "The post office is always messing things up," she laughed. But there was no warmth in that laugh. That night, Darlene called June's number one more time. This time, the line rang once, then clicked off. In hindsight, these were the brushstrokes of something sinister. But in the moment, it was just a feeling, an unease that couldn't quite be named. Nobody knew they were losing June in real time. That she was already gone, not from the earth, but from reach. Hidden, muted, managed. The kind of disappearance that leaves no trace but absence. It was no longer about old age. It was about something darker. And someone had to ask the question out loud. Where is June? The garden was always immaculate. Rows of impatiens and marigolds lined the walkway, just like June used to do it. Lindsay had kept up the tradition, on the surface, at least. She was often seen outside, pruning rose bushes, waving politely to passing neighbors. She wore sun hats and gardening gloves, looking every bit the attentive caretaker, rooted in family and soil. But something was off. The garden had become a stage. Neighbors on Baldwin Street began noticing the discrepancy. Lindsay was visible, watering plants, talking on the phone, sometimes even laughing, but June was conspicuously absent. No one had seen her sitting in her rocking chair. Her humming, once a familiar background tune, was gone. A neighbor, Mrs. Evelyn, who had lived across the street for over 30 years, mentioned it casually to her husband one morning. Strange not to see June. She always swept the porch, even when her hip hurt. And then there were the lights. Late at night, long after the world had quieted down, some noticed a dim light flicker upstairs where there hadn't been one before. Just a sliver behind the attic window. A place no one expected anyone to be. Still, most didn't speak up. They wanted to believe the best. Lindsay was pleasant enough. She waved, made small talk, even offered to help Mrs. Evelyn carry groceries once. But there was a tightness behind her smile, a defensive quality that made people hesitant to push. When Darlene came by unannounced one Saturday afternoon, she lingered on the porch a little longer. Lindsay didn't answer the door at first. Darlene thought she heard something, a faint knocking sound, but dismissed it. When Lindsay finally emerged, she looked tired, irritated. "She's sleeping," she said curtly. "These visits get her worked up." Darlene asked if she could just peek in to say hello. "Not today." Back in her car, Darlene sat for a moment, unsettled. The front of the house was picture perfect. Lindsay had even planted a few new rose bushes. But it all felt like a performance, like something curated to hold suspicion at bay. The house was too quiet, too staged, too off. Behind that blooming garden, behind closed blinds and painted smiles, a darker reality was being carefully obscured. The neighborhood saw beauty, not betrayal. Lindsay knew exactly what they expected to see, and she gave it to them. But June wasn't just missing from porch swings and pews. She was vanishing from the world in plain sight. Every day she spent unseen, her voice softened, her autonomy diminished. And upstairs, above the beauty of the garden, the real truth was locked behind a door no one dared to open. It was a cold Tuesday morning when everything finally cracked. Darlene couldn't shake the feeling anymore. She had spoken with her brother, then a cousin in Atlanta, both of whom admitted they hadn't heard June's voice in months. Only Lindsay's filtered explanations. They compared notes. Each had been told a different version of why June wasn't reachable. She's napping. Her memory's gotten too bad. She gets paranoid. All plausible. All conveniently vague. But none of them had seen her. That's when Darlene made the call. A quiet, reluctant conversation with a local adult protective services worker. "I'm not accusing anybody," she'd said carefully, "but I'm worried." Within 24 hours, the Macon County Sheriff's Office had a welfare check on the books. It wasn't urgent, at least not on paper. But that would change. The officers arrived mid-morning. It was overcast, the kind of winter day where the sun never really rises. Lindsay answered the door, cool and composed. "She's sleeping," she said without blinking. "She gets disoriented if people come around unannounced." The officers nodded, following procedure. But protocol required more than words. They asked to see June. Lindsay hesitated, then tried redirecting. "I can wake her later. She gets confused, thinks strangers are taking her." Her tone was light but firm, as if she were correcting a child. One of the officers, a woman, stepped forward gently. "We'd really like to check on her now." Lindsay's smile faltered. The search began room by room. Downstairs was spotless, photos aligned, fridge full, house warm. The signs of care were everywhere. But June wasn't. They moved to the second floor. Lindsay trailed them, offering hollow commentary. "She used to love this room. I've kept everything just how she likes it." But there was no June. Not in the guest room, not in the study. Then the officer spotted it, a padlock on the attic door. Lindsay's voice shifted just slightly. "She doesn't go up there. It's just storage." But her hand trembled as they asked for the key. Inside, they found June. Thin as a whisper, wrapped in a wool blanket, eyes sunken and distant. Her lips were cracked, her skin pale. The attic was cold, painfully so. A single space heater hummed faintly in the corner, barely enough to break the chill. There was no phone, no bathroom, no calendar, no clocks. Just a cot, a bucket, and a small television with the volume muted. When they said her name, she didn't respond. Not at first. Then slowly she whispered, "Is it still Christmas?" It was March. The officers called EMS immediately. As they guided June downstairs, she winced from the light. One of them gently held her hand. "You're safe now," he said. But the attic air still clung to her. The silence. The cold. And downstairs, Lindsay just watched. The phone was unlocked with ease. Lindsay had left it in the living room, charging on the windowsill. In the chaos following the welfare check, no one thought to secure her belongings right away. One of the deputies noticed it buzzing, an incoming message from someone saved simply as M. The screen lit up with a cheerful wallpaper, Lindsay and June, smiling in the garden. It was an image crafted to deceive. Once a warrant was issued, investigators retrieved the phone and began cataloging its contents. What they found wasn't just incriminating, it was damning. Dozens of voice memos, drafts of legal documents, notes, texts to friends describing June's condition like it was a hurdle, a liability. But one recording would ultimately become the cornerstone of the case. It was less than 30 seconds long. Recorded months earlier, Lindsay's voice, upbeat but impatient, could be heard in the background. "Come on, Nana," she said, her tone thinly veiled. "Just sign and smile for the camera. It's for the paperwork, remember?" There was a pause. Then June's faint, confused reply. "What paperwork, baby?" Lindsay responded, sharper now. "The ones we talked about. Just smile. Say you agree. Just sign." The sound of a pen scratching paper followed. Then a forced chuckle. "See? Easy. You trust me, don't you?" The recording ended with a click. That recording would later be played in court. But long before then, it rippled through the family like a thunderclap. No one could hear it without flinching. There was no violence in Lindsay's voice, no overt threat. But that was what made it worse. It was calm, familiar, the voice of someone leveraging trust with surgical precision. The documents she'd referred to were real. Lindsay had filed power of attorney papers weeks after moving in. Later, she filed a quitclaim deed, transferring ownership of June's house to herself. And then, access to June's retirement funds, accounts June couldn't recall ever discussing. The signatures matched. The filings were clean. Legally, it was airtight, but morally it was a crime. and Lindsay knew how to play the part. Each document had a timestamp. Each recording a timestamp. Every smile online was a breadcrumb in the trail of deception. She had rehearsed this story well, woven it into posts, texts, even casual conversations with relatives. That one recording, though, tore it open. Because in just 30 seconds, the mask slipped. Not all the way, but enough. Enough to see the manipulation, the rehearsed control, the softness used as a tool. Lindsay had studied the lines: caregiver, granddaughter, victim of circumstance. But this was the first crack in her script. The world now had something it couldn't unhear. And June hadn't been signing her future. She had been surrendering it, confused, coerced, and above all, trusting. The signatures were flawless. To the untrained eye, they looked like any other legal filings, neat, consistent, and complete. But to investigators now armed with motive, context, and testimony, those clean lines told a Messier story. Lindsay hadn't just been improvising. She'd been preparing. For months. It started with the power of attorney documents, signed quietly on a rainy November afternoon, notarized by a friend who had no reason to question Lindsay's intentions. June's handwriting, once bold and slanted with loops, had deteriorated into shaky half-letters. But on paper, she had consented. To everything. Once that door opened, Lindsay walked through it confidently. The quitclaim deed was next, transferring June's modest but mortgage-free home into Lindsay's name. The paperwork was filed smoothly at the county office. No flags, no delays. It was official within 2 weeks. Then came beneficiary updates on June's retirement accounts. Lindsay listed as primary. All legal. All irreversible, without June's direct action. But by then, June was a ghost in her own life. Investigators traced the transactions. Small at first, $200 moved here, $500 there. Then larger withdrawals. Home improvements, Lindsay told the bank when questioned. Medical supplies. She's sick. In hindsight, there were inconsistencies. But Lindsay's tone, calm, professional, vaguely exasperated, shielded her. Caregivers are often trusted without question, especially when they look the part. Lindsay knew how to talk the language of burden. She used the right keywords in calls to Medicare reps. She mentioned cognitive decline, wandering, agitation. She downloaded forms from elder law sites, researched how to craft explanations for withdrawals. She had even begun exploring long-term care insurance policies, perhaps for later, perhaps as cover. She built a fortress of paperwork around June, locking her in not with chains, but with protocol. And what made it all so chilling was the precision. There were no errors. Every dotted I and crossed T served as a kind of legal brick, walling June off from her own autonomy. And behind it all, Lindsay stood poised, wrapped in the performance of care. It was the coercion, not the fraud, that was hardest to prove. Because on paper, June had given her consent. In recordings, June's voice trembled but complied. Even in person, she remained confused, unable to say exactly when or why things had changed. But now that the attic had been found, and the phone recording had surfaced, the paper trail transformed. What once looked like order now reeked of calculated betrayal. The line between caregiver and captor was growing clearer by the day. And in the eyes of the law, Lindsay wasn't just guilty of deceit. She was guilty of knowing exactly how to weaponize trust, hiding behind the fine print while the woman who raised her sat freezing upstairs, legally stripped of everything she had spent a lifetime building. June Harper hadn't always been fragile. Long before the attic, before the documents and the silence, she had been the center of a world. A retired elementary school lunch lady, she was known in the community for her laughter, her old-school wisdom, and the way she remembered every child's nickname, even into adulthood. She'd raised 3 kids, 2 boys and a girl, and lost her husband to a factory accident when Lindsay was just a toddler. She survived hardship the way many black Southern women did, quietly, steadily, with pride stitched into every decision. She lived by routine. Up at dawn, gospel music humming from her kitchen radio. A cup of coffee with 2 sugars and a piece of toast. Her dresses were always ironed. Her garden always pruned. Her bills always paid in cash or with a check written in delicate cursive. But things began to shift around her 80th birthday. It started subtly, missing a step in a recipe, forgetting which day to take the trash out. At first, she laughed it off. "Child, I've just got too much on my mind." But soon names began to slip. One day she called her grandson James, her late husband's name. Then she started repeating herself, asking the same question 3 times in 1 hour. Her children noticed but didn't act immediately. It was hard to tell when forgetfulness becomes something more. But the decline came fast after that. By the time Lindsay returned home to help out, June had been recently diagnosed with early-stage dementia. She still had good days, clear, joyful ones, but they were fewer. And she was afraid. Afraid of being put in a home. Afraid of being a burden. Afraid of losing her voice. That fear made her vulnerable. And Lindsay exploited it. Lindsay was charming. She made June feel useful again, asking for her favorite recipes, helping her organize old photos, letting her weigh in on paint colors. It wasn't fake at first. Lindsay may have even meant it. But when June's confusion deepened, the balance shifted. There were days June couldn't recall the month. Days when she repeated a story 5 times, and Lindsay only nodded. She began relying entirely on Lindsay for phone calls, appointments, even meals. She forgot how to log into her own bank account. When Lindsay suggested she take over the complicated stuff, June agreed. She trusted her. And that trust became a trap. June's world had shrunk to the walls of her home, then to the second floor, and eventually to the attic. She hadn't resisted, not with force, but with confusion and quiet compliance. When you forget the pieces of your life, you start handing them off. Lindsay knew that. And June, she didn't disappear all at once. She was erased, slowly, methodically, until only the shell of her independence remained. She had been strong. She had been sharp. But even the strongest voices can go unheard when the world is too willing to believe someone else is speaking for them. Online, Lindsay was radiant. Filtered photos showed her kneeling in the garden, cradling potted plants, or sitting beside June, their smiles bright and intimate. The captions told a story of generational love, #blessed, #caregiver life, #family first. Her followers, many of them acquaintances from college or church, left comments filled with heart emojis and affirmations. "You're a real one," one woman wrote. Not many would sacrifice so much. But behind the likes and filters, Lindsay was building something else entirely, a double life. She wasn't just chronicling care, she was curating an image. One that allowed her to move quietly through the world of elder care finances and social influence without scrutiny. Her social media accounts became proof of goodness, used to silence concern before it could find voice. "Look at all she's doing," people would say. "She's got it under control." No one thought to question the story because she never stopped telling it. Meanwhile, offline, the mask would slip. There were late-night phone calls to friends, peppered with frustration. "She keeps forgetting who I am," Lindsay would sigh. "It's like raising a child, but worse, because they don't get better." She'd roll her eyes when recounting June's confusion. "It's a miracle I haven't snapped." Her voice would tremble, not with sadness, but with exhaustion laced with entitlement. The image she shared in public, a selfless woman giving up her youth to care for her grandmother, masked the simmering resentment building underneath. She began to see June not as a person, but as a weight. A reason her life wasn't moving forward. Lindsay had dreams once. She'd gone to college in Atlanta, studied public relations, even interned with a lifestyle influencer. But after graduation, things didn't take off. The job market was brutal. Bills stacked up. She came back home, telling herself it was temporary, just a stepping stone. But with June deteriorating and the home already paid for, the opportunity shifted. Permanence became power. And slowly, compassion became calculation. She started spending more. A new wardrobe. A premium gym membership. Uber Eats instead of groceries. A few online purchases tied to June's bank card. Nothing major at first, nothing flashy enough to raise alarms. But the pattern was there. Lindsay was living 2 lives. One where she was the heroic granddaughter sacrificing for love, and one where she was siphoning freedom from the woman who gave her everything. She convinced herself she deserved it. She framed her choices as survival. "She's not even aware," she once texted a friend. "It's better this way. For both of us." But the truth was darker. Lindsay had become addicted to the control. To being the center of a story where she was praised, where her needs came first, and where no one asked too many questions, because the world saw what she wanted them to see. A caregiver. An angel. A lie. The Harper family was no stranger to hardship. They'd buried children too soon, survived layoffs and evictions, held each other through hurricanes and hospital visits. But nothing prepared them for this. For betrayal that came not from a stranger, not from outside, but from one of their own. When word got out about June, about the attic, the documents, the recording, it hit like a thunderclap across family text chains and church pews. At first, there was denial. No way Lindsay would do that. There's got to be some mistake. But then came the evidence, the medical reports, the financial filings, the look in June's eyes when asked what year it was. The family fractured overnight. Darlene, who made the initial welfare call, found herself both thanked and blamed. "If you'd called sooner," one cousin said under their breath. Another snapped, "Don't act like you're better, you weren't even visiting like that." Old tensions, long dormant, rose to the surface. Who had shown up for June? Who had looked the other way? Who was Lindsay, really? Some defended her, at first. She was under stress. That house is a lot to handle. But those defenses unraveled with every uncovered detail. The recording, especially, was hard to stomach. One nephew threw his phone across the room after hearing it. "She played us all." The guilt came next. Deep, choking guilt. They had praised her, elevated her, sent her money, told their friends, "Lindsay's a good girl." And all the while, June was disappearing, one paper, one lie, one day at a time. "How could we not have seen it?" became a quiet chorus. Shame settled into their bones like a second skin. June's children, now middle-aged themselves, were left with a tangle of grief and legal knots. There were power of attorney disputes to unwind, court dates to attend, therapy appointments just to process it all. And still, somehow, they had to show up for June, who remained a shadow of the woman she once was. Who woke in the middle of the night asking for her mother. Who flinched when certain doors creaked open. The family tried to rally around her. To cook for her, hold her hand, comb her hair. But there was a space now, a distance created not just by time, but by betrayal. June trusted Lindsay with her life. And Lindsay had used that trust like a crowbar. They went through old photo albums together, pointing at the past like it was a map. "That's when we went to Tybee," someone would say. June would smile faintly, sometimes cry. She wasn't always clear, but she knew one thing now. Her family had to work to earn her back. And the hardest truth of all, they weren't just mourning what Lindsay had done. They were mourning the version of Lindsay they thought they knew. The news spread faster than anyone could contain it. By Sunday morning, the congregation at Mt. Zion Baptist had heard the story in whispers before Reverend Ellis ever stepped to the pulpit. A welfare check, the attic, the documents. Sister June Harper, beloved usher, deacon's widow, and maker of the best peach cobbler on the block, had been found locked away by her own granddaughter. Gasps gave way to silence. Then questions. "She was always so polite," one elder muttered in disbelief. "That girl brought her to prayer meetings, sat right beside her." "She posted pictures," another said, her voice hardening. "Kept us thinking she was doing right." The betrayal wasn't just personal, it was communal. Mt. Zion had watched Lindsay grow up, sung over her at baby dedications, clapped at her high school graduation, laid hands on her when she left for college. The church had been her stage and her safety net. And now it was ground zero for the fallout. There was shame, deep and palpable. "What does this say about us?" Reverend Ellis asked in a closed meeting with church elders. That we didn't see, that we didn't ask. But guilt wouldn't change the past. Neighbors who had seen Lindsay outside, smiling and waving, now questioned themselves. Mrs. Evelyn, across the street, replayed every moment in her mind. "I should have said something. Should have knocked harder." Her husband consoled her, but the regret sat heavy in the air like Georgia humidity. The betrayal was also generational. Elders began to speak more cautiously about who they trusted. Conversations turned toward wills, power of attorney, and who held the keys. In barber shops and salons, the talk shifted. "Y'all better check your paperwork. Don't care if they family, ask questions." For Black communities already steeped in a history of being taken advantage of by systems, the idea that harm could come from within, that family could exploit you under the guise of love, struck like a blow to the soul. And still, some were hesitant to speak too loudly. Respectability runs deep. "We don't air dirty laundry," one church sister said, folding bulletins with shaking hands. "Let the courts handle it." But the truth had already spilled out. The silence that had protected Lindsay for so long was now being interrogated. Meanwhile, June remained largely absent from these discussions, recovering slowly under medical supervision. Her name was on prayer lists. Meals were prepared and delivered. But the community she had helped build was forced to reckon with its own complicity. The trust they gave freely, the assumptions they leaned on. In the end, the real wound wasn't just what Lindsay had done. It was what everyone else had missed. That a woman could vanish right in the middle of her own neighborhood. That love, when manipulated, can become a kind of weapon. And that sometimes it's not the stranger you have to fear, it's the person who calls you Nana with a smile on their face. The news spread faster than anyone could contain it. By Sunday morning, the congregation at Mt. Zion Baptist had heard the story in whispers before Reverend Ellis ever stepped to the pulpit. A welfare check. The attic. The documents. Sister June Harper, beloved usher, deacon's widow, and maker of the best peach cobbler on the block, had been found locked away by her own granddaughter. Gasps gave way to silence. Then questions. She was always so polite, one elder muttered in disbelief. That girl brought her to prayer meetings, sat right beside her. She posted pictures, another said, her voice hardening. Kept us thinking she was doing right. The betrayal wasn't just personal, it was communal. Mt. Zion had watched Lindsay grow up, sung over her at baby dedications, clapped at her high school graduation, laid hands on her when she left for college. The church had been her stage and her safety net, and now it was ground zero for the fallout. There was shame, deep and palpable. What does this say about us? Reverend Ellis asked in a closed meeting with church elders. That we didn't see, that we didn't ask. But guilt wouldn't change the past. Neighbors who had seen Lindsay outside, smiling and waving, now questioned themselves. Mrs. Evelyn, across the street, replayed every moment in her mind. I should have said something. Should have knocked harder. Her husband consoled her, but the regret sat heavy in the air like Georgia humidity. The betrayal was also generational. Elders began to speak more cautiously about who they trusted. Conversations turned toward wills, power of attorney, and who held the keys. In barber shops and salons, the talk shifted. Y'all better check your paperwork. Don't care if they family, ask questions. For Black communities already steeped in a history of being taken advantage of by systems, the idea that harm could come from within, that family could exploit you under the guise of love, struck like a blow to the soul. And still, some were hesitant to speak too loudly. Respectability runs deep. We don't air dirty laundry, one church sister said, folding bulletins with shaking hands. Let the courts handle it. But the truth had already spilled out. The silence that had protected Lindsay for so long was now being interrogated. Meanwhile, June remained largely absent from these discussions, recovering slowly under medical supervision. Her name was on prayer lists. Meals were prepared and delivered. But the community she had helped build was forced to reckon with its own complicity. The trust they gave freely, the assumptions they leaned on. In the end, the real wound wasn't just what Lindsay had done. It was what everyone else had missed. That a woman could vanish right in the middle of her own neighborhood. That love, when manipulated, can become a kind of weapon. And that sometimes it's not the stranger you have to fear. It's the person who calls you Nana with a smile on their face. The courtroom wasn't grand. No marble floors, no sweeping chandeliers, just beige walls, plastic chairs, and the hum of a flickering fluorescent light. But in that modest room, the truth began to take shape, piece by piece. Lindsay sat at the defense table, dressed in muted gray, hair pulled back neatly, expression unreadable. She looked more like a paralegal than the woman now facing charges of elder abuse, financial exploitation, and unlawful imprisonment. June did not attend the early hearings. Her doctors deemed it too stressful. She was still adjusting, physically stronger but emotionally fragile. Her days were punctuated by confusion and clarity, often mistaking nurses for long-dead relatives. But the law moved forward, slowly but methodically, building a case from the trail Lindsay had left behind. Prosecutors leaned heavily on the digital evidence. The voice recording where Lindsay coached June through a signature, the texts where she vented about being stuck with her grandmother, the withdrawal receipts, the deed transfers. Each document became a thread in the noose of manipulation. And yet, the courtroom was no easy battlefield. The defense painted a different picture. A young woman overwhelmed by a failing elder care system, abandoned by family, doing the best she could. They said Lindsay was under immense pressure, that her decisions were clumsy, not criminal. Neglectful, maybe, her lawyer admitted, but not malicious. And with no visible bruises, no camera footage of the attic, and June's own recollection inconsistent, some began to wonder, could it really be proven? Lindsay cried on the stand. Spoke of her dreams deferred, her student loan debt, the nights she sat up listening to June cry, unsure what to do. She choked on her words, glancing occasionally at the gallery where no family sat beside her. Her performance, though calculated, held a cruel kind of power. It stirred something in people, the unbearable grayness of it all. Outside the courthouse, activists debated the ethics of family care, the need for oversight, and the cracks in the elder protection system. Inside, June's family waited anxiously, bracing for a verdict that might not feel like justice. In the end, Lindsay was found guilty on 3 counts: financial exploitation, fraud, and unlawful restraint. The jury took just 6 hours. She was sentenced to 8 years, with parole eligibility at 5. Not life-changing, but enough. Enough to say, what you did mattered. But even justice has its limits. The legal victory did not return June's sense of safety. It did not restore the lost months, the confusion, the isolation. Nor did it mend the family that now spoke in strained tones, still circling blame like it was a wound they couldn't help but pick at. There was no handcuffing of evil in this courtroom. Just paperwork, testimony, and a quiet reckoning. The law could punish Lindsay, but it could not explain her. Not entirely. It could not answer the question that still haunted everyone who loved June. Why? Justice, when it finally came, didn't feel like a clean breath. It felt like a bruise. Lindsay was led out of the courtroom in silence. No cuffs, just the steady presence of 2 deputies at her side. She didn't cry this time. She didn't look back at the bench where her family used to sit. Her sentence, 8 years with parole in 5, landed softly in the room, more like a resignation than a resolution. For some, it was enough. For others, it barely scratched the surface. June's children stood outside the courthouse afterward, arms folded, expressions tight. Reporters asked if they had anything to say. "We just want our mama to be okay," one son said quietly. "That's all we ever wanted." But the truth was more complicated. Because June wasn't okay. She had good days now. Days when she could watch her favorite soap operas, laugh at a story from the past, hum along with gospel music in her recliner. But there were still shadows. Still moments when she called Lindsay's name. Not with love, but with fear. Moments when she asked if the door was locked, if she was allowed to leave the house. The attic lived on in her nervous glances, in her distrust of silence. Therapists said it might never fully leave her. And what about the family? They gathered again for holidays, tentatively guarded. The house had been reclaimed, but the warmth took longer. No one sat in Lindsay's old chair at the table. No one said her name out loud. The family photos that once included her were quietly rotated out. But in the quiet corners of the room, the guilt still sat. Each member, in their own way, had to reckon with their part in June's erasure. The missed visits, the unquestioned excuses, the willingness to believe the Instagram posts instead of asking harder questions. They had let the image of care eclipse its reality. And now, they bore the weight of that blind faith. The church community tried to rally. A fundraiser helped cover some of June's medical costs. Volunteers repainted the interior of her home, new color, new beginning. But the trust once shared was fractured. People looked at one another differently now, cautious behind polite nods. Justice had been served. Technically. But it had left behind ashes, scattered pieces of a life that would never be whole again. Lindsay had stolen more than money or property. She had stolen a season of June's life that could never be reclaimed. The quiet months. The ordinary moments. The soft Sundays when June might have still laughed, still held her granddaughter's hand in peace. Now that memory was severed. And though the law had done its part, June's healing would take more than time. It would take forgiveness, and no one yet knew if that was something she could or should offer. The attic remained untouched for weeks. No one in the family could bring themselves to open that door. It stood at the top of the stairs like a wound that refused to close. Eventually, Darlene returned with a trash bag and trembling hands. She didn't tell anyone she was going. Just unlocked the house with a borrowed key and made her way up, each step groaning beneath her as if the house itself remembered. The air was stale, cold even now. The space heater was gone, taken in as evidence, but the outline of it remained, burned faintly into the hardwood floor. The cot was stripped, the bucket cleaned, but the shape of June's suffering still lingered in the walls. A single slipper sat beneath the window. Darlene stood in the doorway for a long time, unable to cross the threshold. Her mother had once braided June's hair in that house. June had babysat her, fed her grits and eggs on Saturday mornings, made her feel like the center of the universe. And here she was, in the same house, bearing witness to a kind of cruelty none of them had been able to imagine, let alone stop. She thought of June asking if it was Christmas. She thought of the scratchy voice on the recording, obeying. Just sign and smile. The attic, in its quiet way, held all the contradictions. Love twisted into manipulation, care turned into control, trust slowly smothered under the weight of a granddaughter's resentment. It wasn't blood on the floor. It was absence, silence, the cruelness of being forgotten, even while alive. This wasn't just where June had been kept. This was where she had been erased. Later, the family discussed turning the attic into something else, a reading room, maybe, or a prayer space. But no one followed through. Instead, they left it empty. A private kind of shrine. A reminder of what happens when no one listens close enough. When we assume love looks like a filtered photo. When we mistake presence for protection. June herself never asked to go back up there. She didn't need to. The attic was now part of her. The way she flinched at door locks. The way she asked 3 times a day if the heat was on. The way her eyes searched corners of the room, waiting for permission she no longer needed. And yet, there was still a flicker in her. A quiet strength that refused to disappear. She'd begun humming again, softly when she cooked. Her hands still remembered the rhythm of snapping green beans. She held her youngest great-grandchild and sang an old hymn, barely above a whisper. Lord, don't move my mountain. She had survived. But the silence in the attic had changed her. And it had changed everyone who dared to stand inside it. Even now, the question lingers. How well do we really know the people we love? It echoes in the hallways of June's home, in the family's hushed phone calls, in the wary glances exchanged during Sunday suppers that don't feel quite the same. Lindsay was supposed to be the one who stepped up. The one who stayed when no one else could. And for a while she was, until the mask cracked, and the darkness beneath it spilled into every corner of June's life. This wasn't a story of monsters. It was a story of choices, layered by pressure, shame, resentment, and silence. Lindsay didn't break overnight. She slid, one overlooked detail at a time, into a version of herself no one recognized. A version that saw June not as a person, but as an obstacle. Not as a grandmother, but as a means to an end. And June, she never stopped being herself. Even when her memories faltered. Even when her body weakened. Even when her voice trembled from weeks without warmth or water. Somewhere inside, she held on to the core of who she was. A mother, a matriarch, a woman who had made do with little and loved with much. Her recovery remains imperfect. Some days she forgets what happened. Other days she remembers too well. But her family has stopped pretending healing is simple. They don't speak in absolutes anymore. They speak in effort, in presence, in patience. They've started doing something they hadn't done in a long time, listening. The church created a new ministry, one that checks in on elders monthly, no matter how fine they seem. Lawyers from nearby counties have begun offering free consultations on elder rights. In small, stubborn ways, the community has begun to grow something new from the ruin Lindsay left behind. But it's fragile, because trust, once fractured, takes more than apologies to mend. It takes time. It takes truth. It takes telling stories like June's, not to shame, but to warn. Not to exploit pain, but to honor those who endure it. To shine a light on what hides behind closed doors, even when those doors belong to people we once celebrated. Because in a world that rewards appearances, where smiles can be staged and suffering hidden in the attic, we must ask better questions. We must notice the quiet absences, the missed calls, the photo that looks just a little too posed. We must believe survivors, even when their stories don't come wrapped in drama, but in silence. June Harper survived more than manipulation. She survived erasure. And now, her story serves as a reminder. Care is not what it claims to be, it is what it does. And the price of trust? Sometimes it's everything. Every story has 2 sides, but the truth waits in the shadows. Join us as we uncover the hidden truths, the unspoken betrayals, and the moments that define survival. Subscribe now to follow every twist and turn, because in the world of true crime, justice is just the beginning.